I suppose we better start with the chronology if we could actually, Keith. IR35, remind the listeners why this became the hottest of potatoes some months ago. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Nick. Good to speak to you again. IR35, well, what is it? Well, in short, it's a mess. But it's the code name given to some legislation which was first announced in 1999. And this was legislation that was designed to stop employers packaging their employees into limited companies so as to save national insurance and PAYE obligations. And the Revenue at the time announced all sorts of examples of train drivers of newly privatised companies working as a limited company for the train operating company and effectively avoiding PAYE. So legislation was announced in 1999, took effect in 2000, and that was to keep people off the grass. The problem with the legislation, however, is that once it's there, the Revenue can use it not in those extreme cases, which just didn't apply, but in the borderline cases where it's hard to tell whether or not someone's an employee or self-employed. And I accept that 90% of the population can tell they're easily employed, they're self-employed. But there is a large number of people in the middle where it's hard to work out which side of the line it is. And in fact, the courts have said there are cases where you could actually decide validly either self-employed or employed. So there's no clear one answer. So the Revenue were attacking mainly contractors in the first decade of this century. And that sort of more or less stopped around about 2010. There weren't many cases about that time. And then about 2012, they suddenly started attacking colleagues of you, people in the journalism, TV, radio industries who were working for a number of different organisations, but nevertheless had a regular gig. The Revenue came along and said, well, we think all of a sudden, irrespective of the practice we've been accepting for decades, we think you're really employees. So there's now been a string of cases going up through the courts and tribunals. But this is expensive for the workers, it's expensive for the Revenue. As I said, it's a mess. And I haven't even talked about the relevance to the loan charge. So in the middle of the last decade, the Revenue thought we're going to have to move the goalposts. We're going to decide that rather than the burden being on the workers, the contractors, we're going to put the burden on the engagers of these services. They managed to persuade Parliament that there had been widespread non-compliance with the rules. And the report which came out this morning said that the Revenue estimated only 10% of these companies were actually abiding by the rules. But what the report also says, but doesn't actually make the connection, is that the Revenue's test is not consistent with what the courts have been saying. Now, the report says recent case law suggests that the Revenue have been applying the wrong test. Well, recent case law means 1969 or at least 1994. Yes, it's been confirmed again in the Court of Appeal only last month, but at the end of the day, the Revenue has been assessing these cases using the wrong test. Therefore, the 10% compliance or the 90% non-compliance is probably based upon the wrong figure.
I see.
So now moving on to the new rules which came into effect for 2017 for the public sector, and effectively people in government, local authorities and the BBC, because it's a public body, they had to ensure that they abided by the rules. And in order to help them, and I use the word help with a very broad definition, the government or the Revenue put together a computer program to guide people through the tests. Now, most people said the computer program is wrong and it's biased towards the Revenue saying that they are employees. And as I said, remember, the Revenue has been applying the wrong test anyway. But these government bodies have been using this government-owned program to determine the status of their workers. And it appears that they've got the answer wrong. So they've been using the government's own guidance and still getting the answer that the Revenue doesn't like.
Keith, I've got to go to a news bulletin in a moment. In a sentence or two, what happens next, do you imagine?
I hope someone will go back to the drawing board and decide IR35 is not fit for the purpose. I can understand its purpose, but there's an even more fundamental problem. Why should employees and self-employed people be taxed so differently? If one removes the incentive to have people on one side of the boundary or the other, then the boundary becomes less important.
Great speaking with you as ever. I sense there's much for this story to run, and we'll talk again. Keith Gordon, tax barrister, to be found at Temple Tax Chambers. I suggest if you're having difficulties in that area, you might want to avail yourself of the services of a gentleman